Thank you so much, Ben.
So there's a lot to unpack here, especially given the historical context between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Can you first give us briefly describe the current state of diplomatic relationship between the two countries?
Sure, absolutely. With regards to Saudi-Israeli normalization, we've seen how some of the U.S. media and also specifically the Israeli media have been speaking a lot about it as if it's something that's going to happen disregarding all the other prerequisites of the kingdom, which is not something that the kingdom is actually pursuing at all whatsoever. So I think I urge people to not actually believe all the narratives that have been going through Israel, specifically with regards to Saudi Arabia being in a position where they normalize for free. There's nothing going to be for free. And the Saudis have always been voicing their concerns about the status of the Palestinian citizens, because at the end of the day, you cannot actually do a real normalization with Israel without having the Palestinians to be having their own self-determination. It's a must. It's not negotiable, actually, for the kingdom. One of the things, actually, that is different between the Likud and the President or Prime Minister Netanyahu's ideas with regards to normalization with Saudis, I would call it like as a 1 to 10 kind of approach from the kingdom, which is one is to have the Palestinians to have their state, and number 10 is complete normalization with Saudi Arabia. And the moment you have normalization with Saudi Arabia, that means you're going to have normalization with half of the global south, 57 Muslim nations, because Saudi Arabia is the birthplace of Islam and it's the hub of the whole Arab and Muslim world. So there's a lot to gain from the Israeli part the moment they do this normalization. So that's why we want them to have the real approach from 1 to 10. Netanyahu, on the other hand, he wanted from 10 to 1. Normalization with the Arabs, and then this may facilitate some sort of a resolution for the Palestinian issue. We don't see this to be completely legitimate, because at the end of the day, you cannot, as Saudi Arabia, as a heavyweight in the region, as the country that actually represents 1.7 billion Muslims around the world, to just normalize with the assumption that the Israelis at some point will give the Palestinians their actual legal rights.
Right, you brought up a very good point. I think a lot of people look at this as like an on and off switch, normalization or no normalization, kind of like a 0-1 binary.
Exactly.
But I think you put it in a very, very concise way that it's a gradient from maybe like non to kind of normalization. It has to land somewhere in between. And I think this kind of binary thinking is indeed very not the most conductive way to look at it. So let's say if we put it into a gradient of a 0 to 10, what number do you see we are in right now?
Very good question. I think the moment the previous administration did the Abraham Accord, which was actually a very good move, and the Saudis have been encouraging this. We didn't have a problem with Bahrain or the UAE or even Sudan or also Morocco to have normalization with Israel. That actually built some kind of trust with regards to having the Arabs to have this kind of normal kind of relations with Israel. But at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia is not going to do it as easy as the other countries have done it. Because you asked about the number. I think we are somehow, the Abraham Accord facilitated the whole thing to start from number 5. Okay. From number 5 towards number 1, from number 5 towards number 10. That in itself is good. Why? Because at the end of the day, as a political analyst who is not representing the government in any way, I think both propositions somehow have legitimate concerns. Why? Because the Israelis have serious security concerns with regards to, okay, if they have a two-state solution, what does that mean for the future, for the security of Israel, etc. So we understand that, but at the same time, you have to put some kind of moves and some steps, because you cannot actually just have this kind of stalemate and to always mention the Palestinians to not even be existing, because that's one of the officials of Benjamin Netanyahu's. He has actually voiced and had like a statement saying that there's no such thing as Palestinians. Such rhetoric is is not helpful.
Yeah,
it's not helpful in any process,
any discussion.
Even though exactly, and the Prime Minister was actually trying, and his government tried to downgrade that statement, downgrade the importance of it, and they always say this is the kind of rhetoric he, as a person, has, but it's not representative of the government. But at the same time, we see the actions to be matching that kind of statement. So that's the problem. At the end of the day, Israel is a neighbor, and we want it to be a member of the wider Middle East, but at the same time, we cannot have it while we are having a specific group, the Palestinians, to be deprived of their main right. So that's for the kingdom is considered to be, I'm not going to say a black and white, but it's considered to be the main cornerstone of Saudi policy with regards to normalization.
Right, like you have just given us an insight into. There is a lot coming into this conversation. Perhaps a lot more than like the general public, who's spectating it is imagining. And there's another thing that I'm very curious about, because we have recent reports about the U.S. wanting to help facilitate this said normalization. But one of the caveat is for Israel to hold its judicial overhaul. Now, this kind of boggles my mind a little bit, if you can help me dissect the issue, because the way I see it, the judicial overhaul is more of an internal kind of policy. And how does that affect the foreign policy, and how does that relate to the normalization between Israel and
Yeah, that's great. Just to shed light on the judicial kind of reform. So Prime Minister Netanyahu wants actually to I'm not going to say decentralize, but he wants to somehow decrease the influence of the Supreme Court and the judicial system in Israel by being able to appoint, as officials, Israeli officials, to appoint judges. That in itself is definitely an internal matter, but it has caused some kind of concerns with regards to how the Americans are seeing Israel, etc., because specifically people from the left in Israel and people from the left in the United States see this move to be somehow anti-democratic, okay? But it's not us to speak about what's going on inside Israel. Maybe the U.S. is trying to push their agendas through saying, okay, we are not going to pursue any kind of discussion with the Saudis with regards to normalization until you put this on hold. Right. So that's the kind of mechanism or the kind of like narrative. But at the end of the day, it has nothing to do with the normalization. Like if the Israelis manage to have this judicial reforms to be passed or not passed, it's not going to affect any kind of substantial matter with regards to normalizing with Saudi Arabia. Maybe from the U.S. perspective, it's different, and they see this as a prerequisite before they go and push for normalization. And to be honest, I don't think the Democratic Party in the United States is actually very keen to the idea of normalization. Maybe they voiced their hope and optimism about it, but I don't think they are pushing for that so much, because at the end of the day, their differences with the right wing and the extreme right wing in Israel is way bigger than the idea of them trying to make them have a peace with the Arab world.
All right, that's a very, very interesting analysis that you just proposed there. It's essentially, instead of kind of normalization being the goal for the U.S. Democratic Party, maybe that's actually something to wield over Israel in order to achieve the political results that the United States want to see. So we might actually be looking at it like in a different direction. Is actually maybe their incentive in Israel is actually the political structure in the country outside of the normalization. Now, moving on to the same topic, but different perspective looking at it. I'm also curious because Saudi Arabia and Israel, the history goes way back. And of course, there's a lot of conflict between the people. So even if we see normalization between the relationship of the two governments, do you think that the people will be happy, like, either being the Saudi Arabia side or Israeli side? Do you think they will be okay with said normalization?
This is a great question. And I like the fact that you mentioned the word history, because when it comes to history, the golden age of Jews have been under the Muslim rule in Andalusia, in the Middle East, etc. So we've always had this very constructive and fruitful relationship between Jews and Arabs. And let's not forget that they are Semitic groups, so they are actually cousins. So at the end of the day, we should normally be in relationship with the Jews, or specifically with the Israelis, because Judaism is a respected religion, and we consider Judaism and Christianity to be, and Islam to be an extension of all these kind of religions. So, and we should not actually forget the historical aspect that has not been shed light on academically, which is the fact that Umar ibn Khattab, the second caliph of Islam, was the one who returned the Jews to Jerusalem. People do not even speak about that, even though it is documented. So because when he came to Jerusalem and he took it from the Romans, he asked, where are the Jews? So he asked one of his friends to bring 85 tribes from the Levant, Jewish tribes, to come and reside in Jerusalem. And I would love for the Arabs and the Muslims and the Jews to be speaking about these beautiful, fruitful facts about the historical relationship between Judaism and Islam. That's number one when it comes to history. When it comes to the popular opinion in Saudi Arabia, we have to understand that it has nothing to do with being anti-Judaism or being anti-Jews. The narrative, definitely there are people who are considered to be crazy from all sides, but at the end of the day, we need to have cool-headed people to discuss things in a very strategic manner without having and invoking these kind of emotional tensions. The thing is that concerns the Saudis is the political situation of the Palestinians. Before, we have been seeing it from an Arab lens. The Arabs have been seeing the Palestinian issue from an Arab lens. Then they moved it to the Islamic lens, which is Jerusalem, etc. Right now, we are seeing it from a humanitarian lens. That is actually very important, and it is actually better because you don't want to involve ethnicity or religious sentiments into
things
a conflict.
Always get messy.
Exactly, it would get even messier, you know. So we see it as a humanitarian issue. Definitely, the Palestinians have their absolute right to have their own state, and we are not asking for too much. What we are asking for is to go back to the 67 borders, which has been actually agreed upon by the United Nations, 242. So the United Nations have been actually speaking about this, and they consider the territories and the annexations of settlements, etc., to be completely illegal. So what we are saying, specifically through the Arab Peace Initiative that has been proposed 20 years ago, 2002, I believe, is all about go back to the 67 borders, have Jerusalem to be split, East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, the East for the Palestinians, the West for the Israelis, and then have the refugees to be back. At the end of the day, you will have normalization with 57 Muslim nations. There's a lot to gain from the Israeli part. But the problem we have is that they have this narrative, which Prime Minister Netanyahu is actually having this kind of hyperbolic statement that Saudi-Israeli normalization is going to be around the corner. This, I think he is somehow deceiving the public in Israel. And we want the Israeli citizens to know that the Saudis are very ready for normalization, and they are very ready to integrate Israel into the whole wider Arab and Muslim world. Right. But this has to come with a price, and that price is to give the Palestinians their absolute rights.
Right. Thank you so much for this very in-depth analysis. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks for being with us on TV Bureau. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.
And with that, we conclude this edition.